All right, welcome to our Zoom with the Fort Langley National Historic Site. We are excited to be here today with Ammon from the fort, and he's going to teach us a little bit about the fur trade and Fort Langley's role in the fur trade. So Ammon, you can take it away.
Excellent. So if you were with me last week, that's where we left off. Those fancy hats made out of the beaver fur. So I see some heads nodding. Yeah, well, made out of the beaver fur, if you remember that. Some of you do. So we remember that the fur trade was mainly about getting the fur from a beaver, a giant rodent. And they would turn it into fabric we call felt, and they would turn it into those fancy hats like those guys are wearing over there way back in England. And to get that, like we talked about, you would have to travel on a ship from Britain and go across the Atlantic Ocean over to Hudson's Bay, and that's where they built the Hudson's Bay Company. But about 150 years after that company was built, by the 1800s now, the company decided they were going to go all the way to the west. And when they got to the west, they decided they're not going to be going across the continent that we called North America. That would just take too long. So they were going to go on a ship around South America. Now imagine going on a ship that was powered by the wind. How long do you think that would take? A few weeks? Maybe a few hours. If you take an airplane now from Vancouver to England, it might take anywhere between 8 to 10 hours. 150 years ago, if you wanted to go from here to England, it would take 6 months. That's half a year. Think about that. Imagine if you left your family in England to come work on the west coast of North America. And if your mom was still back in England and you want to send her a birthday card, you have to send her the birthday card 6 months before her birthday for her to get it on time. That's the way it was. So here, way on the west coast, we had this land, but there were two main routes we would travel on, and those were rivers. One big river we called the Columbia River. Most of it is down in the United States, but it starts in our province of British Columbia today. And then we had another river that Fort Langley's on, this one in yellow, the Fraser River. Now, on the Columbia River, the Hudson's Bay Company, they said the Columbia was the most important river to them. They built a big fort, and they called it Fort Vancouver. And it's not the city of Vancouver we know today. If we were to drive down to Fort Vancouver from Fort Langley, it would take around 3.5 to 4 hours. But a few years later, they did build Fort Langley on the Fraser River. And when Fort Langley was built, like I said, they had to take all the furs from these forts all the way back to England, just so people could wear fancy hats. And they were pretty much shopping centers. That's all Fort Langley was. So all the First Nations families, they would be bringing the furs and they would trade them like money, use it just like money. That's why we see a beaver on a nickel today, because when you came to shop in Fort Langley, everything wasn't priced in dollars. It was priced in beaver skins. And you could trade for it for tools. You could trade for it for clothing. You could trade for a lot of different items. And this is what the entrance to Fort Langley looks like today. But what Fort Langley discovered was most of our customers, they're not just hunters and trappers. They're people of the river. And the people of the river, well, they're not just bringing us the furs to make these hats. They're bringing us salmon. And Fort Langley discovered we could actually use this salmon. And we're going to cut the salmon into fillets. And these fillets we're going to salt and we're going to pickle them. And we're going to pickle these salmon fillets and we're going to put them in barrels. And these barrels we're going to send to a place called the Sandwich Islands. Has anyone heard of the Sandwich Islands? No, they've changed their name. They've gone back to their original name, Hawaii. Of all the places in the world, Fort Langley sold salmon pickled in barrels to Hawaii. Not just that, on the Fraser River, we had lots of cranberries. Have any of you had cranberries? Probably with Thanksgiving dinner, cranberry sauce. And we'd have cranberries we would ship in barrels all the way down to California because cranberries are high in vitamin C. And you need vitamin C to cure a disease called scurvy. And there were a lot of gold miners down in California that had scurvy. And what scurvy does to your body, if you don't have vitamin C, scurvy causes the gums in your mouth to rot and your teeth to fall out. That's why most gold miner photos or even drawings look like that. Gold miners without teeth because they needed cranberries. And Fort Langley, we made a lot of money just by selling cranberries to California for gold miners. And that's how these cranberries got the nickname red gold. But when we say Fort Langley, we weren't just a fort trading for fur. We weren't just trading for salmon. We weren't just trading for cranberries. Fort Langley was also a farm. And when I say Fort Langley and just a farm, it was a massive farm, 2,000 acres. Now, some of you might not know how big 2,000 acres is. That's 2 times the size of Stanley Park. If you've ever been to Stanley Park in Vancouver, that's a pretty big park. And Stanley Park could fit in Fort Langley's farm twice. And our farm was so large that we had 500 cows, 300 pigs, 200 goat, and potatoes, and more potatoes. We had so much food, and Fort Langley might surprise you. We only had 25 families working in the fort. All this food is way too much for 25 families. So we learned that we could sell the food from our farm all over this area around Fort Langley to all these other forts. This map at one point would have had over 90 Hudson's Bay Company trading forts on it. And Fort Langley and 3 other forts supplied food to all the other forts. It was a very important job. But 30 years after Fort Langley was built, something changed it all. Someone found this. If you found that in your backyard, would you tell anyone? Neither did we. But I'll tell you more about that next week.
Does anyone have a question for Amin? Maybe something you've heard. I know some of you are probably grade 4 or 5, and I've probably heard some of this before. Do you have a connection to something you already have heard, or maybe a question that you have? Lacey.
It didn't come out of the ground like that, right? The shiny thing? It didn't.
The gold? That little shiny piece of gold? Yeah, someone was panning for it, and you could actually find nuggets of gold in the river if you panned for it, just like that. Once we finally open and we're fully open again, we do have a gold panning station there. So if you pan for gold and you find it, you can keep it.
Right.
Real Fort Langley gold.
I have a question. So my question was, if there were only 25 families living on 2,000 acres with all those animals, how did they take care of all of the animals?
That's an excellent question. There was no school. So at the age of 5, you start working. By the time you turned around 11 or 12 years old, you start looking after the animals. But what they discovered was the cows, they can actually look after themselves. So out of all 500 cows, they only really had to look after about 80 of them for their dairy operation to make butter. The rest would actually just go live in the wild in the woods. So if they needed beef, they actually had to go hunting for the cows in the woods. But then the teenagers had to look after the hogs. But even the hogs, they were pretty big pigs. So even the bears in the area, they were too afraid to go attack the hogs. The problem Fort Langley had was the goats, because the bears loved to go after the goats. So one of the assistants to the bosses of Fort Langley, he said, "You know what, Mr. Yale? We need to put these goats on an island, a nice flat island in the river that the bears can't get to them. And we can keep a few of the teenagers on the island to camp out. So if they see a bear swimming on the river onto the island, we can fire a shot from our musket, scare the bear, and the bear will go away." And they named the island after that clerk of Fort Langley, and the island is still named after him. It's called Barnston Island, and that's where we kept the goats.
That's very cool. So another question I have is about the food also. I'm wondering, because there wasn't electricity and refrigerators back then, right?
Absolutely not. So everything had to be kept either in a root cellar. So if it's food that grows in the ground, you have to keep it in a cool, dark place. So you would actually cut a hole in the floor of your house, and you would just keep all that food underneath your floor. It's called a root cellar. Anything else, you would dry it as much as possible, or you would smoke it, or you would salt it. And that's what they would do with the salmon. They would salt it and pickle it. Ever had salted pickled fish? Imagine how that would taste. So we would actually ship salted pickled salmon, 2,000 barrels of it each year from Fort Langley all the way to Hawaii. Because the people in Hawaii wanted our salmon. Does anyone have a guess on why Hawaiians would want Fort Langley's fish? You would think Hawaii has its own fish.
Lacey, can you guess why Hawaii might want Fort Langley's fish?
Because they don't have salmon in Hawaii?
That's a good guess, but we don't have camels in Fort Langley, and I don't want a camel.
Milo, do you have an idea? No? And what about Lincoln? Do you want to guess? No? Why do you think they might want salmon, Lex? Don't know. I think you're going to have to tell us.
Because it looked cool. It was the first colored meat Hawaiians could get. All the meat around Hawaii was white meat, and this was the first red and pink meat they could find. Just because of the color of the fish, Hawaiians paid lots of money for it. And then on top of that, you had all these ships from around the world that were now stopping in Hawaii, so they needed to stock up on food. So Hawaii would always get extra food from Fort Langley and sell that to those ships as well.
I think a lot of times there's a lot of things that we buy just because they look cool. So I think that we can make a connection to that, in that the Hawaiians wanted the fish because it looked cool, and I think we often buy things because they look cool too.
Exactly. And surprisingly, because of that, salmon sold to Hawaii actually made Fort Langley more money than anything else. It made us more money than the fur trade, and it made us more money than our gold rush that happened later on.
That's super cool. I didn't know that. That is something new that that I am learning today. So I have, okay, Lexi wants to know how did, back then, how did they hunt? So beyond the farm animals, how would people hunt for food or safety?
Oh, excellent question. Commonly, they would either set up pit traps or snares, but if you were hunting, more often than not, they would use muskets, those long guns, kind of look like rifles now, but they would use that to hunt fowl, so mainly birds, duck, geese, and swan. And who do you think would be the hunters of Fort Langley?
Can you guess who you think the
Who do
hunter
you think?
of Langley might be? No? Milo, do you want to guess? Who do you think?
I think it would be like that. People that are in their 20s.
People in their 20s? That's a good guess, yeah. It would be the moms and the kids. The dads were too busy under the contracts for the jobs that they were doing in the fort that the moms would be the ones going out to hunt, and the kids would be like the retrievers, catching the birds and bringing them back. But if you wanted to eat bird like duck, geese, or swan, that was our chicken and turkey substitute. There weren't chicken and turkey in these parts yet. So you want to eat a bird, you got to eat duck, geese, and swan. And you can tell we probably loved our swan quite a bit because you don't see them around much anymore.
Awesome. So another question that I have, put your head up, please. Another question that I have is, you said the farm is 2,000 acres. Can you tell us approximately where the boundaries of the farm were using?
Yeah, if you're in Langley today, there's one road that goes right through the middle of it. It's called Glover Road. And then the north boundary of it would be where Trinity Western University is now. And then the southern boundary of it would be where the Langley bypass is. So roughly where Costco is these days. So if you drive along Glover Road and you look along the side of the road, you'll actually see signs put up by the township of Langley saying the old Langley Farm boundary. But that's where it is. So today it's called Milner. And that Milner neighborhood of the township of Langley is the old farm. And Glover Road goes right through the middle of it. The original name of Glover Road, Smuggler's Trail. But I'll talk more about that next week.
Awesome. Thank you, Emin. Boys and girls, does anyone have another question for Emin before we head out? Riley, I see that you just joined us, so welcome. Amin's been talking about Fort Langley and its role in the fur trade. Does anyone have another question? Or I guess I have another question for you. Perhaps you said it at the beginning, but I may have missed it. What years are we talking about? When we were talking about when they traveled and decided to go west to about when they found gold, what year range is that?
Fort Langley was built in 1827. And then the gold rush on the Fraser River happened in 31 years later in 1858.
Awesome. Thank you. Now, next week, you gave us a little bit of a hint of what we were talking about. Do you want to tell us a bit more about what
next week, we're going to talk about when gold was found, how Fort Langley tried to keep it a secret, and then how the rest of the world found out, how many people showed up, and then how it led to British Columbia being born. Because Fort Langley is called the birthplace of BC, and BC was born because of gold being found on the Fraser River. And we'll talk about what that exactly means.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that because Fort Langley does have a very important position in the history of BC and the history of Canada. So we're pretty lucky to live here and be able to have these